Nice to see so many of you all here again. Previously, our two webinars have touched on international human rights law and then mechanisms that you can use. And now these other webinars are going to focus more on specific topics. And so today, we're going to talk more about gender equality and hopefully give you a greater idea about some of the international human rights law, particularly the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and some of the other declarations such as the Bayesian Declaration and some UN Security Council resolutions, and also discuss some intersectional rights, such as how women's rights and children's rights interplay, and how women's rights and disability rights interplay, and where women's rights have come up in other UN committees and things. So I thought that the first thing to do would be to define gender equality. So UN Women defines it as the equal rights, responsibilities, and opportunities of women and men and girls and boys. And that equality does not mean that women and men will become the same, but that women's and men's rights, responsibilities, and opportunities will not depend on whether they are born male or female. So gender equality implies that the interests, needs, and priorities of both men and women are taken into consideration, and that the diversity of both groups is recognised. Also interesting to note that the International Labour Organization, in their definition, further notes that this needs to imply in all spheres of life, which can include the workplace, the marketplace, home, and the community. Equality between men and women is seen as a human rights issue, but also as a precondition for a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world. So if gender equality is our goal, what impacts this goal? There are a number of different things, such as domestic and gender-based violence, sexual and reproductive rights, including access to contraception and access to healthcare services, representation within decision-making at local and national levels, employment rights, such as to work in any profession and to be free from harassment at work, a right to education, including to access and obtain the same quality of education as boys and men, the right to enter into marriages that are not forced and are entered into freely and with consent. These all impact gender equality, and many things impact gender equality. As an easy example, the Global Gender Gap Index was introduced by the World Economic Forum. So this index assesses countries on how well they are dividing their resources and opportunities among their male and female populations, regardless of the overall levels of these resources and opportunities. So it aims to provide a framework for assessing and comparing global gender gap, and by revealing those countries that are role models in dividing resources equitably between women and men. This index has distilled gender equality into 4 areas. So the first is economic participation and opportunity. So they measure participation in the labour force, wages, estimated earned income, and they also measure the percentage of legislators, senior officials, and managers, and the percentage of professional and technical workers. Secondly, educational attainment. They measure the literacy rate and enrolment in primary, secondary, and tertiary education. Thirdly, health and survival. They look at the life expectancy between men and women. And lastly, political empowerment. They look at the number of women in parliament, women in ministerial positions, and the years that the country has had with a female head of state. So as you can see, gender equality encompasses a wide range of things, and that this global index has taken 4 of these in an attempt to measure gender equality in different countries. So now that we understand gender equality, we're going to move on to where this is in international law. So before I go into details on the treaties, I'm going to first briefly discuss the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There were two women in the drafting committee, India's Hansa Mehta and the chair, Eleanor Roosevelt from the United States. And both of these women were strong women's rights advocates. This year is Article 1, and there was considerable discussion about the use of all men in Article 1. The declaration was eventually adopted using the term all human beings and everyone in order to leave no doubt that the Universal Declaration was intended for everyone, men and women alike. Article 2 introduced the principle of non-discrimination, said that everyone is entitled to rights without being discriminated against. It lists protected characteristics for which you cannot be discriminated, and this includes sex. So this means you should not be discriminated against because you are a woman. So CEDAW has been described, or the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination has been described as a Bill of Rights for women. And this quick video here is just going to introduce you to this important treaty.
CEDAW is really important because it sets out a Bill of Rights for women, but also it offers a practical way that governments can look at issues that affect women and actually find policy solutions as well. And it takes an innovative approach because it requires the countries which have signed it, that's almost every country in the world, to take all appropriate steps to eliminate discrimination against women with a view to ensuring their equal development and their equal enjoyment of human rights on a basis of equality with men.
Whether you're interested in not being discriminated at work, whether you're interested in the nationality of your children, whether you're interested in full rights to education, any of these areas are covered in CEDAW. So they are relevant to every woman and girl's life in this country.
In our recent work in the Equality and Human Rights Commission, we have found discrimination to continue to be an issue in many ways. For example, we have found that violence against women and girls is a pervasive issue in our country. The pay gap continues to be about 20% between men and women, and women are disproportionately represented within persons who are paid below the living wage.
My committee is particularly focused at the moment on the role of women in the workplace and the gender pay gap. And we're doing I think, an important report on looking at how effective the government's policies are in this area.
A really important thing that civil society can do is to lobby parliamentarians and civil servants about CEDAW and ensure that they implement all of the elements of CEDAW within the UK, because it's okay to have something in writing, it's okay to have a huge amount of deliberation on text, but it's civil society that calls governments to account.
So that was a brief introduction to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. And I'm going to discuss it in a bit more detail now. CEDAW is about state parties taking all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in all areas of life. And the treaty articles themselves go into detail about these different areas of life. So, for example, Article 5 is about addressing stereotypes, and it says that state parties should modify the social and cultural patterns of the conduct of men and women with a view to achieving the elimination of prejudices and customary and all other practices which are based on the idea of the inferiority or the superiority of either of the sexes or in stereotyped roles for men and women. So Article 5 is about addressing those stereotypes. Article 6 is about the trafficking of women and says that state parties should take all appropriate measures, including legislation, to suppress all forms of trafficking in women and the exploitation of prostitution of women. And then Article 7 is about politics and says that women should be able to vote in all elections and public referenda and be eligible for election that women should also be able to participate in the formulation of government policy and to hold public office and perform all public functions of government. It also says that women should be able to participate in non-governmental organisations and associations that are concerned with the public and political life of the country. Article 10 addresses education, and it says that men and women should have the same conditions for career and vocational guidance, and they should have the same curricula. Also, that any stereotype concept of the roles of men and women and in forms of education should be eliminated. Overall, men and women should have the same opportunities at education, such as to benefit from scholarships and to access programs of continuing education, and also to partake in sports and physical education. Article 11 addresses employment. Similar to the education article, it says that men and women should have the same employment opportunities, and this includes the choice of profession and equal right to remuneration and social security. It also notes that women should not be dismissed from employment for pregnancy and that there should be maternity leave. Article 12 addresses healthcare and access to healthcare services, and specifically includes services related to family planning. Article 14 is about rural women. It notes the particular problems faced by rural women and the significant roles which rural women play in the economic survival of their families. It says that states must ensure rural development programs account for women. Article 16 addresses marriage. It says that women should have the same right to freely enter into a marriage and to choose their spouse. There should be the same rights for both spouses in respect of the ownership, acquisition, management, administration, enjoyment, and disposition of property. So as you can see, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination does address discrimination against women across all areas of life, including within the home, within the public, within politics, and within the community. I'm now going to move on to the individual complaints, the process of which I touched upon in the second webinar. And I'm going to discuss some complaints under this convention now. So this is Ms. Carreño, and she had separated from her husband, who was called FRC. FRC was the father of her child, and she separated from him after suffering domestic violence for a number of years. After their separation, FRC was given unsupervised contact with their child, despite their child being scared of him. Ms. Carreño tried to get protection orders for herself and for her child, but these were not given by the courts in Spain. Tragically, FRC killed their child during a court-allowed visit and then committed suicide. The committee found that Spain violated her rights under Article 5, that the state should take all appropriate measures to modify the social and cultural patterns of the conduct of men and women, and that they also violated her rights under Article 16, that the state should take all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in all matters relating to marriage and family relations. The committee said that Spain did not take reasonable steps to protect Ms. Carreño and her child against violence, of which the state was aware, and that when the terrible tragedy had occurred, the state did not investigate its own failings, and that they were negligent in protecting this woman and her child from violence. The committee recommended that Spain investigate failures in its structures and practices that led to the death of Ms. Carreño's child, and that it ensured domestic violence is taken into account in custody matters, and that judges receive training about domestic violence and about gender stereotyping. The committee has repeatedly found that a state can be held responsible for acts of individuals if it fails to exercise necessary diligence in order to prevent violations of the CEDAW Convention. And this decision shows that here the state was aware of the violence and did not protect this woman. Moving on to another decision, this time regarding employment. Ms. Medvedeva studied inland waterway and coastal navigation. She then qualified as a navigation officer. She applied for a position of helmsperson motorist at the Samara River Passenger Enterprise. Her application was originally approved, but it was then rejected due to a government regulation. This regulation listed jobs considered harmful or dangerous to women, and therefore it was prohibited to employ women in these roles. Helmsperson motorist was on this list, and therefore she was unable to take this role. The committee found that her rights under Article 11, that the state should take all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in the field of employment, were violated. The committee recommended that this list be reviewed and be amended. So I've talked about some of the decisions under the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, but non-discrimination also comes up in other treaties, and discrimination based on gender is prohibited under many other UN human rights treaties. So Article 2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights emulates the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and prohibits non-discrimination. Article 3 goes further in that state parties need to take account of the factors which impede the equal enjoyment by women and men of each of the rights in this covenant, and a state needs to rectify the situation where men and women do not enjoy equal rights. Article 23 is again similar to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It states that men and women have equal rights and obligations regarding marriage. And lastly, Article 26 requires state to act against discrimination by public and private agencies in all fields, and this includes discrimination based on sex. So now turning to an individual complaint to the Human Rights Committee. So Ms. MT was an independent journalist and founded a human rights organization. She was arrested, interrogated, beaten, and detained in police stations and prisons on and off for approximately 6 years. While detained, she was abused and she was operated on without her consent and had her uterus removed. She complained about how she had been treated. And regarding discrimination, she said that the state discriminated against her on the basis of her sex by sterilizing her without her consent and by subjecting her to sexual abuse. The majority of the committee held that these acts did violate her right to be free from discrimination on the basis of sex. The decision said that the acts were a specific aggression against her as a woman. And this decision illustrates how women can be discriminated against because of their bodies. Moving on to the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. This covenant also prohibits discrimination, including on the basis of sex. And Articles 2 and 3, as you can see here, use the same wording as that in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that I just discussed. There have also been decisions about sex discrimination by the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Committee. So this example here is that over her working life, Ms. Calero made pension contributions. She made over 300 contributions. Half of these contributions were voluntary and were at a time when she was not working and was instead caring for her children. At one point, she paused her voluntary payments for 8 months. She then later paid these payments. She returned to work after caring for her children and continued to make pension contributions. She applied for early retirement. This was denied. The Ecuadorian Institute of Social Security said that because she had paused her payments, this had disaffiliated her from the retirement scheme. The Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Committee said that this had violated her right to Social Security in her rights to non-discrimination and gender equality. The committee noted that women were usually unpaid care workers and could face discrimination from purportedly neutral retirement programs not devised with them in mind. Voluntary contributors, who were mainly women, were at a disadvantage because they were expected to pay both their share and the employer's share of the payments, even though they did not have an employer when they cared for their children. So this case highlights that schemes may appear neutral when you first look at them, but that women need to be considered, and that if they are not, then this may be discriminatory. Other conventions also mention gender discrimination. The Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on the Protection of the Rights of all Migrant Workers and Members of their Family again use the non-discrimination paragraph originally used in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and again used in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. There are no individual communication decisions on these articles, but I did want to highlight that both these treaties do contain the non-discrimination article. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is the newest human rights treaty, and the inclusion of a general principles article is an innovation and is something new. While these principles shape other UN human rights treaties, this convention lists these principles in Article 3. Non-discrimination and gender equality is a principle that has shaped other UN human rights treaties, but in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it is deliberately included in this article to clarify that these principles apply to all articles of this convention. Furthermore, Article 6 recognizes that women and girls with disabilities face many barriers across all aspects of their life, and this article aims to respond to this. While it reflects non-discrimination, it further requires states to take active measures to ensure that the barriers faced by women and girls with disabilities are removed, and that women and girls with disabilities have their human rights fulfilled. There has been some complaints under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So Ms. Z laid this complaint. At the time of her complaint, she was pregnant and a single mother. She also had albinism. She was attacked at her home and had her arms chopped off, and she miscarried. Following the attack, she was isolated from her community and faced harassment, discrimination, and stigma due to having no arms and due to her albinism. The committee said that Ms. Z, being a single mother, being pregnant at the time of her attack, and suffering a miscarriage contributed to her being isolated from her community. These characteristics are linked to her being a woman and are therefore sex-based discrimination. Furthermore, the authorities in Tanzania do not consider these elements, and therefore there was a violation of Article 6, which is the article I just discussed on the previous slide. Ms. Z faced multiple forms of discrimination due to her sex, disability, and having albinism. And often it is important to consider when dealing people the various forms of discrimination that they may suffer. That's been a brief introduction to some of the conventions that address non-discrimination and some of the decisions made by these committees. I'm now going to move on to some other pieces of international law that address gender equality. So this video is going to give you an introduction to the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action.
I declare the NGO Plan on Women, 1995. We are all witnessing a historic moment, a moment which is characterized by unprecedented solidarity.
Stop violence against women.
If there is one message that echoes forth from this conference, Let it be that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all.
In 1995, 189 countries adopted the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, a visionary roadmap for equality between men and women. Nearly 20 years later, we have made progress, but we still have a long way to go for men and women, boys and girls to be equal.
Much has been achieved, but much more needs to be done, and it can be done.
Picture it. Picture a world where all girls and boys go to school. A world without gender stereotypes. A world where there's equal pay for equal work. A world without child marriages. An end to violence against women and girls. This is not a women's issue. This is an issue for humanity.
I'm working for a world where women are safe from violence, where girls can grow up safe, healthy, and strong.
We want planet 50-50 before 2030, and we want substantial progress by 2020. Together, we must turn this picture into a reality. Empowering women, empowering humanity, picture it.
Kalpana. Представьте себе.
Imagínalo.
Imagine. 展望未来. Khayalo.
Picture it.
The Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action is a roadmap for achieving gender equality. It also provides a framework to analyse the situation of women around the world and to assess state efforts in achieving gender equality. It was first adopted in 1995 and continues to be updated and implemented. The Platform of Action covers 12 areas of concern, as shown above. These are women in their environment, violence against women, the girl child, women in the economy, institutional mechanisms, women in armed conflict, human rights of women, education and training of women, women in poverty, women in power and decision-making, women in health, and lastly, women in the media. Each area of concern has related strategic objectives and actions to be taken by government and other actors such as international organizations, development organizations, educational institutions, and the private sector. For example, for the area of concern, violence against women, actions for government include to condemn violence against women and refrain from invoking any custom, tradition, or religious consideration to avoid their obligations, refrain from engaging in violence against women, enact and or reinforce penal, civil, labor, and administrative sanctions in domestic violence legislation to punish and redress the wrongs done to women and girls who are subjected to any form of violence, and adopt and or implement and periodically review and analyze legislation to ensure its effectiveness in eliminating violence against women. These are only a sample of the actions for government. In total, under violence against women, there are 19 actions for government. There are also actions for local governments, NGOs, trade unions, international organizations, and the UN itself. The Platform of Action is reviewed every 5 years by the UN Commission on the Status of Women. The Commission on the Status of Women has a leading role in monitoring and reviewing progress and problems in the implementation of the Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action. And I understand some of you may have attended their annual conferences. It is important to note that this document is only a declaration and is not legally binding. However, while it is not legally binding, It is a blueprint or a framework to advance gender equality. Countries are encouraged to use it to create their own strategies and plans to advance gender equality, which I understand Kyrgyzstan has done so. Moving on to another piece of law, the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. This video I'm about to play was created to celebrate 20 years of this resolution and illustrates what has been achieved and what can further be achieved.
Il y avait des femmes dans les groupes armés, il y avait des femmes qui ont subi le conflit. Et nous avons subi le conflit plus que tout le monde. Nous étions au cœur de ce conflit.
I believe that we achieve a lot, and at the same time, what is important is to go beyond organizing women or helping them to organize and meeting with them regularly. I think what's really important is to turn that into meaningful and significant participation of women in those processes.
C'est elle qui peut aider à changer les mentalités et le comportement. C'est pourquoi nous avons initié ce qu'on appelle les cases de la paix. C'est pour que les femmes entre elles commencent à travailler, à communiquer, à se donner des informations, à élaborer des stratégies.
In the UN, women and the others, they organize platforms for women who cannot come on board in the government platforms. The women in South Sudan are very resilient. They are even bridging the gap between the opposition and the government. They sustained this peace agreement.
When the two leaders started fighting, I got involved in mobilizing women and support them. But that was a big challenge to me that made me to devote a lot of effort so that I can make sure that women participation is increased in peace processes and peace building, and especially the communal reconciliation.
Étant aussi membre signataire de l'accord, je suis là. Je ne suis pas visible. Maintenant, nous avons besoin qu'on doit nous écouter. On doit aussi nous prendre en compte dans toutes les mesures.
UN Security Council Resolution 1325 was adopted unanimously by the Security Council in 2000. It has been summed up by the phrase, "No woman, no peace." This resolution reaffirms the importance of involving women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts and in peace building, and calls for equal participation in all efforts regarding peace and security. It states women need a greater role in decision-making about conflict prevention and conflict resolution. It was the first resolution to explicitly require parties in conflict to prevent violations of women's rights. There are 4 pillars of implementation regarding stages of armed conflict: prevention, protection, participation, and relief and recovery. This resolution discusses women's involvement in each of these 4 pillars. Security Council resolutions are binding. The Security Council further encouraged states to develop national action plans to detail how they would fulfill this resolution. And I understand that Kyrgyzstan has adopted a national action plan under this resolution. So last webinar, I mentioned special procedures, and there are some special procedures focused on gender equality that I wanted you to be aware of. This is the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. The working group is comprised of 5 members with equal geographical representation. The current members are Dorothy Estrada Tunk from Mexico. She is the chair of this working group. Ivana Radicic from Croatia, Melissa Upreti from Nepal in the United States, Elizabeth Broderick from Australia, and Meskedem Tichane from Ethiopia. The working group was established in 2010. It was established in recognition of the fact that women and girls across the world are still subject to significant disadvantage as a result of discriminatory laws and practices. This group was created to intensify efforts to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women and girls throughout the areas. The group focuses on many issues, but has a focus on men's accountability for gender equality and gender backlash, women's autonomy, equality and reproductive health, women's land rights, the criminalisation of adultery, discrimination against women and nationality, and women human rights defenders and gender discrimination. This group is also a strong advocate for the Beijing Declaration and the Platform of Action. The reports they have written have been used for drafting law and when designing policy. For example, their reports were used as a reference in the process of drafting the Moldovan National Plan of Action on Human Rights and during public debates about this plan. Their country visits have also had positive impact. For example, following this group's country visit to Tunisia in 2013 and a subsequent communication with the government following their visit, recommendations for stronger constitutional provisions on gender equality and non-discrimination, particularly during the drafting of new legislation, the government of Tunisia promulgated a new constitution in January 2014, which contained groundbreaking provisions which guarantee, protect, and strengthen human rights. Following the visit, the Tunisian government also lifted some of its reservations to CEDAW. So this is some positive examples of what the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls have achieved. There is also a special rapporteur on violence against women and girls, its causes and consequences. This special procedure was established in 1994 due to concern about continuing and endemic violence against women and about the marked increase in acts of sexual violence directed notably against women and children. The mandate of this special procedure is to seek and receive information on violence against women and girls, its causes and consequences, to recommend measures to eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls and its causes, and to remedy its consequences, to work closely with all special procedures and other human rights mechanisms and cooperate closely with the Commission on the Status of Women, and to continue to adopt a comprehensive and universal approach to the elimination of violence against women and girls. Interestingly, this mandate includes ensuring that violence against women was integrated into the United Nations Human Rights Framework and its mechanisms. This is the current Special Rapporteur, Reem Al-Salem. So those are the special procedures that specifically address issues facing women and girls, although obviously other special procedures will touch upon issues that face women and girls. So as a brief summary of my presentation, due to social structures, traditions, stereotypes, and attitudes about women and their role in society, women do not always have the opportunity and ability to access and enforce their rights on the same basis as men. There has been great progress, but there is still a long way to go. As the saying goes, women's rights are human rights. Women's rights are contained in many documents. A good place to start is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. But if there are also other issues at play, you can look to other documents. For example, if fair trial rights are a concern, you could look to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. If the woman has a disability, you could look to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Or if you are dealing with a girl, you could look to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There are also documents that, while not legally binding, provide a blueprint for working towards gender equality. Specifically, I've touched upon the Beijing Declaration and its Platform for Action, and the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. There are also special procedures whose mandate is in the area of gender equality. And in my previous webinar, I touched on how civil society can interact with special procedures. I've also mentioned the process of individual communications or complaints to United Nations human rights treaty bodies, which you can use. And I've given some examples regarding gender equality in this webinar. It is also worth mentioning that gender equality and women's rights are frequently mentioned during all treaty body reviews and during the Universal Periodic Review. So you can raise issues for women across many mechanisms of the United Nations. So thank you very much